The first card showed up 3 weeks after Diane Morrow moved into her new house outside Braden Falls, Minnesota. Cream-colored cardstock, the expensive kind, with beautiful penmanship and no return address and no stamp, just sitting in her mailbox like someone had walked up and placed it there by hand. One line, thanking her for something she hadn't done yet. She threw it away that first time and figured it was left over from the previous owner, some kind of old thank you note that got stuck in the back of the box. By the 4th card, she'd stopped sleeping with the lights off. By the 6th, she wasn't sure the cards were coming from outside the house at all. Diane was 46 and fresh off a divorce that took more out of her than she'd ever admit to anyone. And her daughter Chloe had just left for college in Connecticut, which meant that for the first time in 20 years, Diane was completely alone. She worked night shifts at the county hospital and bought a small ranch house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac outside Braden Falls, Minnesota. 1 story with vinyl siding and a chain-link fence and a big backyard and a basement she figured she'd use for storage someday. The previous owner had left in a hurry, with boxes still stacked in the hallway closet and an old coat hanging on the back door. Half a life just abandoned in place. But Diane didn't think much of it, because people leave things behind all the time. The first card read, "Thank you for leaving the kitchen light on tonight." She hadn't left the kitchen light on, not yet, because the card arrived on a Monday morning, and Monday night hadn't even happened. Monday night, she fell asleep on the couch reading a paperback and woke up at 6 in the morning with every light in the kitchen still burning bright. 4 days later, the second card showed up in the same mailbox with the same handwriting on the same cardstock. It read, "Thank you for not answering the phone at 2:17 a.m. She almost laughed at that one. Almost. But that night, at exactly 2:17, her phone rang from an unknown number, and she reached for it and knocked it off the nightstand. And by the time she picked it up, the ringing had stopped, and there was no voicemail and no callback number, and nothing at all to explain who had called or why. That was the moment the air in Diane's house changed. Not the temperature, but the weight of it, like the rooms had been listening to her this whole time, and she'd only just now noticed. The third card came on a Monday, and it thanked her for leaving the back door unlocked on Thursday, 3 days before Thursday had even arrived. Diane swore she wouldn't do it, and checked the lock 3 separate times before she left for her shift that week. Thursday, she pulled a double at the hospital and got home at 11 with her arms full of grocery bags, and she walked in through the back door and set everything down on the counter and sat on the couch for just a second and fell asleep without locking anything at all. She woke up at 3 in the morning shivering because cold air was pushing through the kitchen like January had somehow crawled inside the house in the middle of summer. And the back door wasn't just unlocked, but was wide open, not cracked and not ajar, but wide open to the backyard, like an invitation to something she couldn't see. And there was that smell filling the whole kitchen, wet earth, not garden soil, but something deeper and older than that, the kind of dirt that hasn't seen sunlight in a very long time. She searched every room in the house and found nothing taken and nothing moved, nothing she could see anyway. Then came the basement card that read, "Thank you for not checking the basement when you heard the noise." 2 nights later, she heard a sound from below the floor, something heavy being dragged across concrete, slow and deliberate, like whatever was moving it down there wanted her to hear every inch of it. She didn't go down and told herself it was probably just the water heater acting up, because that was easier than the alternative. Next morning, she made herself check and the air down there tasted stale, like something sealed shut for years had cracked open overnight, and everything looked normal, except for one long, wide drag mark running through the dust on the basement floor, smooth and continuous, like a body had been pulled across it, and the mark ran all the way to the back wall, a solid concrete wall with no door and no seam and no opening of any kind, and the drag mark ended right there, like whatever had been dragged just went straight through it. The next card read, "Thank you for falling asleep on the couch instead of your bedroom." That night Diane fought it and went to her bedroom and lay down and stared at the ceiling for 3 straight hours, trying to force herself to stay. She couldn't do it because something she couldn't put a name to was pushing her out of that room, like hands flat on her chest, and eventually she gave up and went back out to the couch. In the morning, the house was dead quiet, not even the usual creak of the floors settling, and when she walked to the bedroom, she found the door closed, even though she always left it open, always, every single night since she moved in. Inside, the bed was made, but not the way she'd left it, because this was tighter and neater, like someone had taken their time, smoothing every wrinkle, and on the pillow beside hers, where her ex-husband used to sleep, there was a head-shaped impression pressed deep into the foam, as if someone had been lying there all night long. She touched the pillow, and it was cold, not room temperature cold, but the kind of cold that goes straight into the bone and stays there and makes your hand want to pull away on its own. Something had been lying right next to where she was supposed to sleep, close enough to reach over and touch her. Diane told her neighbor Mark about everything, because he was a retired electrician and a good man who checked on her every couple days, and he said it was stress, said divorce does strange things to the mind, and he offered to watch the mailbox himself to put her mind at ease. The whole time Mark watched that mailbox, not a single card came. But the very first day Diane checked the mailbox herself, there it was, sitting right inside, with the same handwriting, on the same cardstock. It read, "Thank you for telling Mark. He won't remember." She asked Mark the next day about the cards, and he looked at her like she was speaking a language he'd never heard in his life, and said she'd never mentioned any cards to him. And he meant it, because his confusion was completely real, and whatever memory he'd had of those conversations was just gone, like someone had reached into his head and erased it clean. If you're still listening, you're the kind of person who doesn't look away, and I respect that. If this channel speaks to you, you already know what to do. But right now, let me tell you what happened when Diane stopped following the instructions. Diane put a security camera aimed straight at the mailbox and checked the footage obsessively every single day, looking for anyone or anything that might be delivering those cards. Nobody ever showed up, not on any day, and not at any hour, and not a single person or animal or shadow went anywhere near that mailbox, on any frame of any recording. But every single time she walked out and opened it, there was a card sitting inside, like it had always been there, like the air itself was writing them and slipping them in between 1 second and the next. The next card read, "Thank you for ignoring the knock at 11 p.m. Diane decided she was done being afraid on someone else's schedule, so she turned on every light in the house and put a kitchen knife on the coffee table and sat down and waited. 11 p.m. came, and with it, 3 knocks at the front door, patient and unhurried, like whatever stood on the other side knew she was inside and had absolutely nowhere else to be tonight or any other night. She checked the peephole and saw nothing but an empty porch and an empty street, and then she opened the door anyway, because she needed to know. There was nothing there, but the air was wrong, because it was a July night in Minnesota, and she could see her own breath hanging in front of her face, and that smell was back again. Wet earth, and deep earth, and something that smelled exactly like grave dirt. On the welcome mat, there was a single bare footprint pressed into the fabric, still damp, with no trail leading to it, and no trail leading away. Just one print facing her door, like something had appeared there out of thin air, and stood watching her house. Next morning, she found the final card, and it read, "That was your last warning. Thank you for what happens next." And then there was nothing at all. No more cards, and days passed, and then a week, and then 2 weeks of complete silence. And the silence should have been a relief after everything, but it was worse, because the cards had been horrible, but at least they told her what to avoid and what not to do. And now she had nothing. Now she was walking blind through her own house, with no guide and no rules, and no way to know what was safe anymore. 3 weeks into the silence, Diane finally cleaned out the hallway closet, the one packed with the previous owner's things that she'd never touched since she moved in. And behind boxes and old coats shoved all the way to the back, she found the shoebox. Inside were dozens of thank you cards with the same handwriting on the same cardstock, but these were old and yellowed and brittle with age, years worth of them, maybe decades worth, stacked carefully in rows. They weren't for Diane, and every single one was addressed to someone named Ruthie. Diane tracked down the previous owner through the realtor and found out her name was Ruth Calloway, and that she'd lived in that house for 14 years before leaving one night without any warning and moving to Arizona with no forwarding address. When Diane called the number she'd found and gave Ruth the address of the house, the line went quiet for a long time, with nothing but the sound of breathing on the other end. And then Ruth said 4 words. "You're getting them too." Ruth told her everything, how the cards had started 6 months after she moved in and continued for years and years, and how she followed every single instruction she was ever given because she was too afraid of what would happen if she didn't. Every instruction except one. Ruth said the card told her not to look in the bathroom mirror after 2 in the morning, and she looked anyway. And what she saw wasn't in the mirror, but was behind the glass somehow, standing there in the dark, in a space between the mirror and the wall that shouldn't have existed, patient and still and waiting, like it knew she would look eventually. She said she wouldn't describe what she saw, and couldn't, even if she wanted to. But she told Diane one thing that Diane never forgot for as long as she lived. Ruth's exact words were, "The cards aren't protecting you, Diane. They're studying you." That night, Diane sat on the couch, with every light in the house blazing, running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline, because she hadn't really slept in days. At 3:14 in the morning, every single light in the house went out at once, and the TV died in the same breath as the fridge stopped humming, and the clock on the wall stopped ticking, and every sound in the world just stopped, like someone had pressed a button somewhere and turned reality off. And then, from the hallway, she heard breathing that wasn't hers, something heavier and wetter and more patient than anything that belonged in that house. She couldn't see a single thing in front of her because the darkness was total, the kind that presses against your open eyes like a hand, but she could feel it, the way you feel someone standing behind you in a checkout line at the grocery store, that animal certainty stamped into your spine from a million years of evolution, screaming at you that you are not alone in this room. Then something moved in the dark and made a sound that wasn't quite a voice, more like the shape of a voice, like something old and patient was remembering how human beings make words. The lights came back on all at once, and everything hummed to life again, like nothing had happened at all. On the kitchen counter, where absolutely nothing had been sitting 10 minutes ago, there was a card, and she picked it up with both hands, shaking so hard she almost dropped it twice before she could read it. It read, "Thank you for staying very still. You may have one more week." She turned it over, and for the first time since the card started, there was something on the back, a drawing done in careful dark ink, showing her house from above, the floor plan of every room exactly, right down to the closets and the bathroom and the kitchen where she stood right now. Every room except one, behind the basement wall, the solid concrete wall where the drag marks had ended all those weeks ago. The drawing showed another room, a room with no door and no way in and no way out. And in the center of that hidden room, there was a circle, drawn careful and precise, with tally marks scratched around it, 14 of them in a neat little row. 14 marks for the 14 years Ruth Calloway had lived in that house. And right next to those 14, there was a 15th mark, drawn in ink so fresh and dark, it was still wet against the cardstock. One mark for Diane. The cards hadn't been warnings, and they hadn't been protection, because every single instruction Diane followed was just another data point. Every habit and every fear response, and every moment she was vulnerable, and every moment she was alert, all cataloged and studied and learned by something beneath the foundation that had been doing this for longer than she'd been alive. The cards stopped because the learning was finished, and whatever lived down there now knew Diane better than she had ever known herself, and it was ready. Diane packed one bag that same night and got in her car and drove 1,200 miles straight to her daughter's apartment in Connecticut, without stopping for anything but gas. She didn't go back for the furniture, and she didn't go back for her clothes, and she called the realtor the next morning and said 2 words: "Sell it." That was 8 months ago, and Diane lives with Chloe now, and doesn't talk about the house, and doesn't talk about the cards, and she sleeps with every light in the apartment on. But she's getting better, slowly, day by day. 3 months ago, Chloe mentioned something small over dinner, said she'd found a card in her apartment mailbox with no return address and no stamp, and beautiful handwriting on expensive cardstock. Chloe laughed about it and said it was probably just junk mail that got mixed in with everything else. Diane asked her what it said. Chloe smiled and told her, "Thank you for inviting your mother to stay." Diane's fork hit the plate because she understood now that it was never about the house. It followed her home. This has been Ashen Frequency. The story's over, but if you're being honest with yourself, you know something about it followed you here. Good night.